Today's guest is Chris Ling. He's the presenter for today. He is also a data engineer at Flux. He's also alumni at the Tech Academy, and he has a very broad, extensive background. Not only is he a graduate of the Tech Academy, but he's also a graduate of MIT in environmental sciences. He was also a lawyer. Was that correct?
Yeah, that's true. I was also a lawyer. Yeah.
For I think it was like 8 years, right?
I'm still technically a licensed attorney, but since 2009. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's definitely has quite the background there. And so today he'll be going over his experience with career development. He has history with that and how to develop your general skills in networking, applying to jobs, interviewing skills. And so we'd like to welcome Chris Ling, and we're very happy to have him.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Tony, and thanks, Rick, for setting this up. This is like the second time that I've gotten the opportunity to talk with people at the Tech Academy communities, like students, graduates, and those who are just kind of, interested in trying to tackle this process head on. I'm going to go and share my screen now and hopefully get it to the right tab. Let's see, here we go. And if everybody can see my screen.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. So, okay, great. So I want to just jump in right ahead. The last time I gave this presentation was in June, so it's been a little while. So yeah, the formal title, like Tony mentioned it, but it's really more real talk about tech interviews. And I think that for a lot of people who are new to the software engineering space, or it's been a while since they've gone through the interview cycle, there's a lot of anxieties and concerns and issues that people have, and we're just going to go very methodically through this entire process and hopefully dispel some of the particular stereotypes and preconceptions that people have about the tech interview process. So who am I? As Tony mentioned, I'm a Tech Academy bootcamp graduate. I graduated in May 2017. I am currently a data engineer at Flux. So it's a distributed startup based in New York, Portland, and San Francisco. And we work in the HR space to promote internal mobility. So how do we retain talent within companies so that they have opportunities, not just in that initial role that they got hired, but how do they grow and develop within a company? And how do you make sure that we don't have people who get lost through the cracks and find opportunities elsewhere when those opportunities exist at where they're currently at? So hopefully Rick will be able to give access to these links to everybody, to my slides, and so you can access these links. But there's my company's website and some Medium articles that we wrote and a recent interview that I had with my CEO with respect to my career journey. So for people who are interested in learning more about me, there's a 30-minute video there, and you can see me in a sleeveless shirt with a hot dog university background talking about how I became a software engineer. So I want to start talking about interviews with a simple thesis. Tech interviews, they suck. Tech interviews suck. And that's a reality that I think a lot of you who have already started going through the experience have already seen. So it's just sort of what is this? Especially for people who have not been in this type of interview before, you see it and you're like, oh my God, this is completely unlike any other process in which I've applied to a job. And why do tech interviews suck? Tech interviews are varied and inconsistent. Tech interviews are biased. Interviewers are biased in their beliefs, and tech interviews do not equal what you experience in day-to-day work. And what each of these things mean is, in terms of variety and inconsistency, you could have a tech interview that's a lightning round of 5 to 10 questions where you're answering how do I code something right away and doing it as quickly as possible. You could have a 1-hour session where you have an algorithms problem that they want you to communicate sort of an approach to a problem and solve it right there. You could have a interview where people are asking you about terminology with respect to technology concepts, or how to approach a problem just from a theoretical perspective. You could have design interviews, you can have, like talking about a project. The fact of the matter is that, there's a lot of different buckets that interviews go into, and every company's certain that the way that they're doing it is like the right way to do it or the best way to do it. And really, like, it just means that it's more work for everybody if they're looking for a variety of jobs. Tech interviewers are also very biased in their belief. And what I mean by this is that a lot of people who are sitting in that interview side, they have a preconception of what a software engineer is and what that background is. And in today's world, where we have a large growth of people coming from non-traditional backgrounds like coding boot camps instead of 4-year CS degrees, or learning on their own and are trying to break into the industry, or people who, just kind of like learned in a more adjacent or non-traditional way, like that's something that uh, does not, like, it's not something that interviewers necessarily one-on-one relate to. And a lot of the issue is, how do you create a relationship or a connection between who you are as an individual and what skills you bring to the table when there's this perception that is on the side of the interviewer. And finally, as I've mentioned, just by the variety of tech interviews, they don't equal day-to-day work. You're not asked on a day-to-day basis to go and like, merge a bunch of an array of arrays or flatten an array of arrays into an array as a day-to-day basis 20 times a day. Like, you might have a problem that encounters something like this, like once in a while, but it's certainly not done at the pace and the frequency and the intensity by which you are being evaluated in a tech interview. So I really want to start out with by saying that we all know that in large part, this process is very stressful and very not coded to sort of the realities of being in the industry, and just embracing that absurdity for what it is, even though we strive to challenge it and overcome it. So why are you here? I have some suspicions as to why people are coming to this presentation. Maybe it's something that's very specific, very technical and tactical. Like, you're an awesome coder, you feel very confident about your abilities to work on the day-to-day job, but you're struggling with the specific strategies to consistently approach whiteboarding problems and code challenges. And you just need that like little, like, how do I tactically approach an interview? Maybe you're a graduate of a boot camp, or you come from a non-traditional background and you have imposter syndrome, as many of us do, even people who have 4-year CS degrees. You find it hard to sound credible to employers because you don't have any software job experience or a CS degree. And I completely feel this, having gone through this process myself 3 years ago, where, like, the only experience I had was being in this boot camp, and working maybe for 2 weeks for the live coding projects module that the Tech Academy provides. And, like, you feel like, is that enough for me to really like talk in depth about my abilities to code? And finally, maybe this is your first exposure in general to any sort of white collar work. Like, maybe you come from a service industry background, maybe you're a blue collar, you worked in as an auto mechanic or in the restaurant industry, or worked as a nanny, or worked in any other kinds of contexts where you didn't have to go into an office day by day. And you don't know what a quote unquote professional interview is, and you don't know what office politics and dynamics are. And this just seems like something out of TV, something strange and unfamiliar. So let's try to figure all of these things out together with these different, like, stakeholders in mind, and with these different issues in mind. So here's sort of the roadmap that I want to go through with the rest of the presentation. I always start with the roadmap. This was something I learned as a legal professional and studying for the bar exam. We always get sidetracked by shiny things. So, like, I want to be able to reinforce that we're taking this very deliberate path through this presentation. So first of all, we're going to start with, for those who don't have any experience working in a white collar context, general professional strategies that would apply to any industry and are also, just as effective as a software engineer or somebody who's working in technology. Then we're going to take a step and talk about how do you embrace that coding bootcamp or that non-traditional background. And then finally, we'll go into the nitty gritty and talk about, if you are sitting in a tech interview, like, how do you approach tactically, timing management wise, or approach how to go through that algorithmic process of working through a tech interview. And then finally, if we have some time, I want to go and present to you a take-home coding challenge that you can follow up with me after this presentation if you have any questions, but I think this will be a great way to sort of simulate something that's a hybrid of several different types of tech interviews. So first of all, let's start with general professional strategies. And a lot of this, and I want to just preface that a lot of these tips and strategies were like sort of like in a pre-COVID world, but there are ways to kind of adjust to our new remote lifestyle. So just keep that in mind that this is not something that you pass off because we're not meeting people face to face in the same way anymore, but just kind of adapt them to where your needs are in a virtual setting. So everybody thinks like the job application process and the interview process starts at the interview, but it doesn't just start at the interview. There's a lot of prep work that you can do in advance to submitting your application, your cover letter, like formally applying to a job on a website. And a lot of these have to do with sort of how do you build your network, both in the terms of the short term, like your immediate job search, as well as for the job searches you anticipate 3 years in the future, 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future. You have to build a community. So it's not the size, but it's not the size of the network that matters, but it's the quality of the networking that counts. And like there are a lot of, for example, even now, virtual meetups that are happening, just like online hackathons, that sort of thing. And you might hear some advice from some career professionals who say, go to everything, or, like try to get out there as much as you can. But I actually am of the opinion that you should attend things that genuinely excite you, because your enthusiasm for the work and your enthusiasm for the event is going to show if you're genuinely excited. And if you're not, you're going to look like it's going to be uncomfortable for you. You're not going to make the right connections. And then to the extent that you're kind of like bending the truth a little bit with respect to what your interests are, now you have to perpetuate that white lie, and maybe it's taking you down a path that's not helpful for you. So do things that genuinely excite you. And to the extent that we did this in person a lot, but you can still do this in a remote setting. You don't have to network alone. Figure out a buddy system. I know that a lot of meetups and happy hours now, they do like these little breakout rooms and stuff like that, but like try to find people that you can go to events with, so that you can sort of play off of each other, that it's somebody who knows you better and can speak more eloquently as to kind of the work that you've done and the curriculum that you've gone through and what your experience is. If you aren't the kind of person who can communicate that with sort of like that confidence and casualness, and you're still trying to learn how to build up your narrative for yourself, like have somebody else do that work for you and you be that person for that other person. um, Once you get into a situation when you're communicating with somebody, like somebody new, say it's a software engineer at another company, or a product manager, or somebody who at a company that you want to apply to, or just want to get to know a little bit more about, I would say, if you can't speak on the fly, like really rely on elevator speeches, but in the right way. And I'm telling you, I still do this today. Like I've had many years of experience giving presentations in the legal context, advocating for people, as well as in the software engineering context. But I still will answer questions to myself out loud in the shower when I'm driving in the car. I will ask myself questions, and like just to hear how credible I sound. I will ask myself, talk to me about a recent strength that you exemplified or you demonstrated, and talk to me about a recent failing that you had in the office. Like you need to make it sound like that you actually know what you're talking about, and that you don't sound like you're just making things up. Elevator speeches, at the end of the day, aren't not meant to be scripts that you read rotely, but they're supposed to be flashcards that trigger in your mind your way to improvise. So think about it like more like jazz, in a sense, where like you have a framework for how you want to answer a question or how you want to approach a topic. But just as in any casual conversation where you have not a lot of knowledge, you're not going to say things exactly the same way, and you're going to be in an environment where you're applying for dozens of jobs. So you don't want to feel like you're saying exactly the same thing 20 different times. So the point is to practice to forget your elevator speech. So have something very specific in mind to help you develop what your voice is and what your narrative is. But you're ultimately trying to abandon this thing that has, this foundation that you provide, so that you can speak more organically when you're meeting with professionals and colleagues. So say that you successfully charmed somebody at some initial interaction and you want to do a follow up, a one-on-one where you want to dig in detail about that person's career or learning more about their company, and you're trying to figure out the logistics. Make yes the only possible answer to an ask. So what I mean by this is you want to know as much as you can about the person you're cold calling or the person you're following up on. Do some LinkedIn research, light LinkedIn stalking, nothing inappropriate, appropriate for a professional context. Make sure that when you're communicating with this person in terms of setting an initial ask or to meet, that you're personalizing and individualizing your opening message, that you're not just sort of like doing it as a transaction, and lay out all the possible plans and suggest the logistics of the meeting. So I love it. I love it when a person will cold call me out of the blue and say, "Hey, like I looked at your profile. I'm really interested in learning more about your company and what you do. Here's our connection. And here are some dates and times, like very specifically, here's some dates and times in the next 2 weeks that I'm generally available. I'm open to working around your schedule, but just to kind of get things off to a good start, like to a quick start, like here are some options. Cause then I don't, all I have to do is then like look at those dates, look at my calendar. Do I have time? I'll slot it in. As opposed to now I have to go through the negotiation process with this other person about what his calendar schedule is and what my calendar schedule is. Like just make it so that if I can say yes, I'll say yes. And then finally, or maybe it's finally, but next, I would say that as you start building these relationships with people, you build them. Don't lean on them right away. And I know this can be really stressful for people who are in the immediate pipeline to wanting to get hired now and to get a job now. But I'm telling you that this long term view is going to pay off in dividends because people are people first. They're not job dispensing machines. Like, as much as even I, as somebody who devotes probably more time than the average software engineer to working and volunteering, giving career development advice, and to talking with coding bootcamp graduates and software engineers, I don't have the ability to wave a magic wand and to provide a job that doesn't exist. And I can't, and I don't want to just be asked, "Hey, can you be a referral if I apply to this job?" Because then I know I'm not forming a relationship. And I know this from firsthand experience because when I was a young attorney, when I graduated from law school and passed the bar in 2009, it was the bottom of the recession. And I had a new kid. I was desperate to wanting to have financial security, and I really thought like I needed to get a job right away. And so I focused that desperation and energy in the way that I communicated with others, and I didn't build genuine relationships. And my ability to get follow-up conversations or to like moving through the application pipeline was diminished as a result of that, on top of the fact that we were in an economic depression or recession at the time. What I found out that was that after the fact, after I realized that like just hounding people about jobs was not the way to go. I started actually like participating in my community. I volunteered here and there. Like I met relationships with people just to hear about the awesome work that they were doing, and I made sure to follow up on those things. And like I said, this is the 3 years down the line plan, the 5 years down the line plan, or whatever that relationship timeline is. By the time I was more well situated in my career and I could start making decisions for myself in terms of how I chose where my next step would be, I had tons of people in my corner who were unsolicited sending recommendations and referrals to the companies that I was applying at. Like just giving me praise because they had actually worked with me on things, that they had developed a relationship with me on, that they were comfortable with their ability to advocate on my behalf. So make sure that you understand that good relationships take time to bear fruit, and you want to find good mentors and advocates and know the difference between the two. I think there's some new words now with regard, or new terminology with regard to what an advocate was. So I apologize if you're familiar with different terms, but a mentor is somebody who's usually external to the company context that you're in. That's supposed to be, like your sounding board, your somebody to be that you can be frank with, sort of about your experiences in the industry, and somebody who can really just support you in terms of just where you are in the community. Whereas an advocate is somebody who's, like got your interest in mind in terms of your advancement within a company. So there's two different reasons why you would want to have these groups of people. Like mentors serve as a confidant, somebody that you can really be honest with, and even talk about your company, in a free setting. Whereas somebody who's an advocate is somebody who's specifically an advocate is somebody who's specifically like there in your company and knows your work and knows your product and knows like where are the opportunities inside the company for you to advance. um, Rick, I see that we have some chats. Does it make sense for me to hold these questions until the end of the presentation, or should I just jump in and look at things?
You can answer them as you go along.
Sure.
But wait until it's a good break for you.
Yeah, I think this one seems like it's relevant. G Yano asks, how long did it take for you to build those relationships to where you felt you had a good network to rely on? I would say like just like any sort of job, I usually think like 6 months of just like regular interaction is a good place to start, like feeling out where like where you can start testing out little things here and there. And I realized like there are some people who are like, if you've made an impression, that that might be a much shorter time scale. But I would say like my general philosophy about jobs is that it takes usually about 6 months for me to get a stronger footing and familiarity with a job. And so I feel the same way with regard to relationships. So that means like, like you didn't just have a coffee like twice in 6 months, but maybe that means like, you chatted every 2 weeks, or maybe you chatted every month, like, and then you maybe sent a few emails and like talked about who you are, and maybe you went to a couple of events with that person. It all really depends. I would say that that's usually a good litmus test. So for those of you who are still in the program right now, like just because you're working on like your coding modules right now, like this is something that you could start on and get a head start on like right now. Yeah, thanks for that question. And finally, with regard to other people who you should build relationships with, like your cohort mates are your first and future colleagues. The people that you are working with right now, side by side, in terms of going through Python modules, going through C#, learning about JavaScript, these are the people who are going to be in the industry with you at the same time, who know what you went through in order to make this transition, because they're going through that transition. Like really culture, really, like make sure that you're cultivating those relationships. That's something that I think that people don't think about, because they're thinking about, I need to get through this coursework, I need to do that. I actually, there are a couple people here and there through the Tech Academy that I still keep in contact with, and every time I see a position that reminds me of them, whether or not like that person's actively looking, I'll pass information along, and I'll say, hey, like this looks like this fits kind of what I remember you've been working on in the last 6 months. Like maybe look at this. So again, these are the people who are going to be in your corner and know the most about you in this industry. Okay, so another, I think, more housekeeping stuff. For me, I think that organization is a huge part of developing these relationships. So organize, calendar, and track things explicitly. I have a rule of thumb, because I used to be the kind of person who would always say yes to a thing and never plan it out. And so I would constantly feel stressed about, oh man, I don't have the time to do this. I'm overextended. I'm like, just feel busy all the time. Rely on your calendar, and rely on your calendar or some calendaring type system. Maybe it's a notebook, maybe it's Google Calendar, maybe it's some other technology. But if it's not on the calendar, it's not a priority. And that goes to work things, that goes to social things, that goes to networking things. If it's on the calendar, treat it as sacrosanct, meaning that you will treat, once it's on the calendar, a work schedule, a scheduled event is the same priority as a personal scheduled event. And I will go ahead and do things like schedule, for example, like a break. Like say I want to do, in a pre-COVID world, a day trip, or I wanted to go and do something with my son. I have a 12-year-old. I put that on there and I say, like, this is my time. What I would typically find in people, this is drawing from my legal experience, was that attorneys would always feel overextended, because they always kept, they either did one of two things. They either didn't put their personal things on their calendar and therefore never prioritize things, or they would always shift their priorities to a court date, to a meeting, because they never respected their personal well-being and their health equally to the amount of work output that they provided. And those things are tethered together. You can't be an effective software engineer or an effective professional without being being in good health and being effective in terms of taking care of yourself. So think about going on vacation, think about family stuff as things that you are doing to maintain your ability to work as a successful professional, just as training is important to that, just as going to networking events are. These are all part and parcel of you kind of like holistically growing and being successful as an individual. And then sort of like finally, like in terms of housekeeping, like ground yourself with little rules of thumb. Like calendaring is an example of this, but like the more that we ritualize certain things for ourselves, the more that we allow ourselves to be more consistent about things. So here's a couple of quick examples. Refine, not recreate the wheel with application materials. So I know like maybe a lot of you are encountering job applications where you have to write cover letters and you're just like, I can't write 50 different cover letters. It's just a lot of work. Work on the draft of a good, like general purpose cover letter in terms of getting the narrative across of who you are, what skills you bring to the table, what your general interests are, and make little refinements for individual companies. Don't change 80% of your cover letter for a job. Change like 10%, 20%. Like make sure that there are variations on a theme, because what's core is that you have this personal narrative about yourself as a software engineer. That should remain relatively fixed no matter what company you're applying at. It's the little contextual things, the connections you're drawing with that specific company, that will be something that you'll modify for a particular like job application. Some people ask me this because they come from completely non-white collar job to a white collar job, dressing formally versus dressing confidently. So I used to wear suits. Like I'm not wearing a suit right now. I'm wearing just an undershirt and I'm wearing shorts. And that's fine in the context that I'm in. But if I were applying to a job in the software industry, I remember like when I was in my first few interviews, I still was uncomfortable about sort of like where I was in terms of wearing a blazer. Do I wear slacks? Do I wear jeans? Do I wear polo? The fact of the matter is, I think about the respect that you want to provide or that you want to convey to a company. And you can always ask, like, what is the dress code? And they'll typically tell you like, oh, jeans are fine, like a collared shirt or whatever. But again, like dress in a way that you think represents what your conception of respect for somebody else is. And I think there's hardly going to be times where people are going to be like, oh yeah, I just totally have like mud all over my shirt and I'm going to an interview like that. Like obviously don't do something like that, but I think you can have a little bit of self-judgment about what is your appropriate like level of respect that you're providing in dress. And there's really quite more flexibility in tech than in other industries. When you're communicating, if you find that you have to think about something, don't just like run your mouth and just hope that your brain catches up. Just like be concise sometimes, take considered pauses. I can fall into that trap myself where sometimes I'll go on a tear and I'll just ramble on and on and on. But using these kinds of tactics of like just being able to allow yourself a pause to recollect your thoughts makes you look like you're being deliberate about how you're communicating who you are and just sort of a concept that you're talking about. And then people remember simple acts of thoughtfulness. So if you had coffee with somebody and you have access to their LinkedIn or the email, like send them a thank you. After you after you've interviewed for a job, if you have the recruiter's email, send the email to the recruiter and say, please convey my thanks to such and such for interviewing me. I really appreciated it. And just kind of remember, like throwing in those little anecdotes, like really matter. They show that you paid attention. They show that you're interested. Like that you show genuine interest in a company as opposed to just sort of shotgunning through the interview process. So just remember those simple acts of thoughtfulness. That is a big relationship builder. All right, so that's all the general stuff. Now let's talk about us as a cohort of non-traditional software engineers. How do we embrace the coding bootcamp background? So a lot of the concerns that people come to me with as they graduate from a coding bootcamp like revolve around a few things. I don't have any work experience. It's just a tech academy. It's just this boot camp. I have nothing to show for that. Or, it's been a while, I dabbled in coding but I've never like formally held a position and this is my first position. This is where your projects are critical towards you developing that fluency and comfort in how you communicate about technology. Know your projects like the back of your hand. The projects stand in as the work that you would do if you were working as a software engineer in a software engineer job. And what I mean by knowing, I've broken this down to several bullets. Divide up the work that you did on a critical project or like a big project that you worked on during boot camp into the various stages of the software engineering lifecycle so that you can start thinking about how would you have approached you developing the software in the context of a job versus in the context of scrambling to get everything done in like 2 or 3 days. Like really go through these sections. So it's product ideation. What is the user story and who are the stakeholders? What was the problem you were trying to solve? Like why is this a compelling app that you were creating? Even if it's something that's been created time and time again. You want to know what the story is and what need it's that this app is meant to satisfy. Design. How did you go from that ideal product, say that you had unlimited resources and unlimited engineering, and you could do anything you wanted with a wave of a hand, to what was your MVP? What did you actually produce? What did you actually deliver? So talk about that conversion, that translation, that transformation from the thing that you absolutely would want to the thing that was needed. Architecture. Can you draw your project out on a whiteboard? Like, can you, and it doesn't have to be super complicated with, I think like if for those of you who've seen pictures of people drawing software architectures, you see a bunch of arrows and boxes and, like cylinders that represent databases. But you don't have to do that. You just need to be able to conceptually draw out, like where are the pieces of interaction within your app. So say you have an app that has a front end, like a display, and it's tied to an API, which is tied to a database. Those are three distinct components that you can draw, and then you can show the relationships between those things. And I have a little bit of like an example in place a few slides down. Technical details. Can you describe your stack and walk through the code? If I were to sit here with you, and say, let's look at GitHub right now and let's look at a project that we worked on. Can you tell me what were the technologies you used to spin everything together? If I were to ask you a question about, like line 56 of your code, could you feel comfortable either knowing it like the back of your hand or at least conceptually understanding what is happening in that general area of logic? One of the attendees here for this presentation, I'm sorry to call you out, but Benjamin, he and I talked earlier this week, and we went through that. We went through his GitHub page and we walked through parts of his code. And I had questions from the perspective of a product manager and from the perspective of an engineer, asking like, what would happen if I put these inputs here? How would I be able to distinguish whether or not, we talked about a weather app, like how would I be able to distinguish between a city like Portland, Maine versus Portland, Oregon? What happens if I get multiple results? Like we talked through these technical details so that I could challenge him on being able to say like, I understand how these different parts of my code base interact with each other. Retro. Can you critically, and critically is the important word here, describe the good, the bad, and the lessons to learn? Over at Vacasa, my first job, we called this plus minus delta. So what were the positives of we would work in 2-week sprints. So what were the positives of our sprint? What did we accomplish that was like went above and beyond and what was worked as intended? The negatives, what were sort of the unintended things that had happened? Where did we slow down? Like what were we not able to accomplish? And delta, what will we change knowing the information we have now at the end of the process about what we had done during the process to improve and to learn? These are the kinds of things that show, especially for junior engineers, like that you have a capacity to grow and to identify with honesty where your limitations are and where your strengths are. That is so important for a senior or a lead or a manager to understand, because that's how they're going to interact with you. We're going to know that for a junior that we are going to give you some time to spin up, but that we have to be confident that you're going to ask us the right questions, that you're going to approach a problem consistently, and that you're going to learn from your mistakes. And finally, the roadmap. What would you change and what would you add to your version 1.1 versus 2.0? So don't just build a project and be like, I'm done with it. It's going in my back closet. Like it's done, along with all the island of lost toys. Make sure that you are thinking about, okay, like I've got the MVP. What would be the next exciting thing that I would work on in a hypothetical world? And if you can actually show that after you've delivered this project for school, or your toy project for yourself that you've built on these things, that shows that you have an interest in like incrementally making things better, because that's a different skill set from just building a thing. It's maintaining a thing. That's a skill set that you're going to primarily be doing working as a software engineer. You're probably not, as your first job, going to be building a ton of things. You're probably going to be maintaining a ton of things. So that's important that you're able to roadmap things out. So that covers, I think, a huge point, but like know a project like the back of your hand. The second thing that I tell coding bootcamp graduates is don't hide your non-software background. Engineers work on code, but also work with people and against deadlines. I think people forget about this, but software engineering is a service-oriented industry. We provide services for people. Much like when I was a lawyer, I was in a service-oriented industry. Much like working in a restaurant, which is a service-based industry. We're here to, understand what the needs are of our clients, whether they are legal clients, whether or not they want dinner, whether or not they want to interact with an app. We want to be able to assess what their needs are, and we want to be able to timely work on things that address those needs, and we want to deliver those things and get feedback and create this sort of virtual cycle of service. So I plead for everybody to go through the experience, the specific exercise of drawing connections between your past and your present. So I was mentoring somebody at Alchemy Code Lab over next to Powell's, and so he came from an auto mechanic background, and he asked, like, he's like working on his resume. I looked at his materials, and I was like, "Why are you not talking about your auto mechanic background?" And he says, "I don't think that's relevant to like being a software engineer." And I said, "Bullshit, it does, because let's walk through what you do as an auto mechanic. Somebody brings your car in, they're your client, and they say, I'm having problems with my car, like smoke's coming out of the engine or whatever. So they give you a problem that they're experiencing, but they maybe don't know what it's tied to. Your first job is to go as a technician, as an auto mechanic, is to start diagnosing using a set of, like a certain workflow, or a set of, like regular types of diagnostic checks in order to assess where the problem is. That's you inspecting your code base and identifying where are the most likely areas where that problem has occurred based off of the effect of the problem. Then you sort of figure out, like you've diagnosed the problem, and thankfully, I think for auto mechanics, they also hook up to computers and they get to see the codes in terms of like what sensors are going off and everything. But once you've diagnosed what the problem is, you're not just randomly opening up the car and like throwing things around and trying to like get to like dig things and just kind of like putting things together. No, you're formulating a plan of attack, right? Like you're saying, in order for me to go to the engine block, I need to move these pieces of the car out and organize them in this order. Then I need to make sure that I have, when I'm working on the engine block, that I have these tools available, these replacement parts available. You're planning a lot of things out in terms of what is the timing by which you are coordinating the repair of this issue that's in the hypothetical car. Then what happens is, after you've made all the changes, you're running diagnostics to confirm that those issues are not appearing anymore. So you're doing validation, you're doing QA, you're doing user acceptance testing. And then finally, you release. You've deployed to production, you've returned the car to the client gives you feedback, and if there's further problems, they'll come back to you again, and the cycle starts anew. That's something, again, somebody who has no software experience can translate that work from a non-software context to software engineering. And you might not come up with this often enough in terms of like, somebody will, like an interviewer might not directly ask you, okay, so tell me about how being an auto mechanic is like being a software engineer. But they might ask you a question about like, how do you approach working on a complicated code base where you need to diagnose a problem? And you could say like, oh, like this is how we typically approach it. And actually it draws back on a lot of experience that I worked on when I was an auto mechanic. Like, this is how I would approach a problem. I would write notes down, and I would go and make sure that I wasn't just like randomly like looking for where the problem was, but I was thinking about it deliberately and proactively. Draw on your past experiences. They actually give you an advantage over people who are coming in with just straight out of college, who don't have any work experience. So don't abandon the hard work that you've done in the past to get that got you where you are today. And then finally, like, I think there's varying schools of thought on this, like adding personal interest and esoteria to humanize and not commoditize. So like, you're a human being, But like recruiters who are reading through resumes are like, they're reading them at like what? Like they're not giving you more than like 30 seconds to 5 minutes looking at your resume and looking at your materials. So to the extent that you want to stand out, talk about something interesting about you. Like I've written in pasts about how I organized an incredibly competitive series of themed pie competitions in 2014. Like that's on my resume. Or I talk about the fact that, like outside of work, I'm semi-sporty because I'll play all these alternative sports. Like maybe it's dodgeball, or maybe it's futsal, or maybe it's rock climbing. That's the kind of thing that once you get to it, like a recruiter, even though they don't know who you are, they'll like, oh, I've done this activity, or oh, that sounds interesting. And out of the statistical like sample size of hundreds of applicants, like that might be the random thing that pulls you out, because they can start formulating a picture in their head about who you are as an individual and not a piece of paper. So it's low cost, and like if I want to be completely pragmatic about it, it's low cost to add your personal interest there, and it's only to your benefit. I can't really think of a situation or many situations where somebody was like looking at a personal interest and decided, oh, you decided to go and tell me a little bit more about yourself, I'm dinging you. Like that I am going to specifically not go take you to the next step because you wrote something about yourself. I don't hear very many examples of that from recruiters, and I don't hear very many examples of that from software engineers. If anything, they just don't remember. But the ones that do remember, that's an edge that you have. So another thing that I think software engineers are concerned about are, okay, I don't know what I want to do. This is my first job. Like I don't know if I'm a back end person or a front end person or a full stack person. Be open-minded about your opportunities, but specific about your interests. So instead of declaring your major or saying, this is where I want to work, they're like, say, this is a thing that I really enjoyed working on, but like I am flexible towards working in these, either the full stack or I'm working in front end stuff. But here's an example of something that really excited me. There's a fine line between appearing flexible versus appearing indecisive. So flexibility, again, is you saying, like I am confident that I would be able to succeed at any part of the stack. Let me give you an example of something that I'm confident about. That's how I want people to think about being specific about their interests. So again, I give this, the phrase, I'd be happy working the full stack, but I've recently been interested in work in React, or I've been recently interested in D3, or I've been recently interested in Pandas and NumPy. Like that's something where you can still be specific, but be flexible. Admit your gaps and redirect to your strengths. So if you don't know something, you don't know something. Take 5 seconds to admit that you don't. That will show a recruiter that you have, or a software engineer that you have the maturity to show where your limitations are. It's better than trying to bullshit your way out of it and spend 5 minutes trying to figure out whether or not you've actually addressed the question that they've asked, and then you find out that it's completely fallen apart. Don't waste the time of the interviewer. Don't waste your own time. Don't give yourself that stress. So if you don't have the exact answer or skill, but you have a reasonable alternative, or you have, like a educated guess as to what it would be, propose it with that caveat. Say like, I'm not familiar with this phrase, but based on kind of what you're describing to me, like I think it might be this. Or say, I've not encountered this concept before. Could you provide me with a little bit more of an explanation? I may have inadvertently worked on something like that, but I'm not familiar with the phrase. Try to be able to redirect or be able to reframe things so that it's not just looking like an answer with a lack of knowledge, because chances are you might have touched a thing but just never heard what the formal name is for something. And finally, I think we talked about this in the general interview, show initiative and reflection post-interview. So ask the interviewer for feedback and how to better prepare for the next round. This was a specific tip that I employed for myself when I applied for my first job at Vacasa. I had a 30-minute, maybe it was an hour-long technical screener on the phone, and it was a bunch of conceptual questions where they asked me things, and conceptually, I thought I could answer maybe about 60 to 75% of the things. I mentioned that I was making educated guesses on some of them, and I also did the redirection. Like towards the end of the interview, I said, "Hey, I know that you've asked me a lot of conceptual questions, but if I could also point you to the work that I've done while I was at the Tech Academy, here's a thing on my GitHub if you wanted to take a look at it." And weirdly enough, like the interviewer like just straight like clicked on the link, went directly to my GitHub page and started asking me questions about my code. And thankfully, I had a great story about it because like it was the end of my Python module, and so they at the time they said like, here are these 35 operations we want you to employ in some piece of software. So I created a text adventure about getting cash from your grandma on your birthday and how you would spend it at the convenience store. So it was this text adventure where you could like buy things, sell things, and incorporated math, like math equations. They incorporated different data types like lists and dictionaries. And so he asked me things like, oh, you know how to build functions, or is this class-based? And that showed him that like my strengths, like that I could actually do the work. And so at the end of the interview, I followed up and I said, like, hey, like you asked me a lot of conceptual questions, and like I would love to keep moving forward. Like if I were to move on to an onsite, like how would I better prepare for that experience? And he gave me a list of 5 to 7 things to study. He said, like, our stack is PHP. We probably want you to know about these like concepts. And I studied them, and I got in onsite, and I went there, and sure enough, they asked me those questions, and they better prepared me because I at least took the time to conceptually understand what those things were. Similarly, if you didn't ask at the end of the interview, a follow-up email addressing something in the interview could show initiative and growth. So say that you flubbed a question at the end of an interview, and like immediately after the interview was done, you're like, oh shoot, I totally knew what I was talking about. Fire off a quick email saying like, hey, thank you for the chance to interview. My interviewer so-and-so asked me this question, and I just thought of something right now that I think answered his question. I just wanted to pass it along if that's okay. Worst case scenario, they don't pass it along. Best case scenario, you look like that you were thinking about this interview and that you were engaged. And finally, you may get asked the same question or types of questions in the next round. This is also what happened to me when I applied at Vacasa. Like I got asked by different engineers, several of the same conceptual questions almost exactly to the letter. And because I was writing down notes and I tried to like learn the things that I wasn't good at after I went through an interview, that helped me in the subsequent interview. Okay, so that's all the bootcamp stuff. We've talked about what does it mean to be a professional in a general sense. We talked about what does it mean to be a software engineer from a coding bootcamp or a non-traditional sense. Meat and potatoes, or I should rather say coding strategies and tips are sort of the vegetables of the interview process, because we know that it's good for us because it leads to an offer, but we all hate our vegetables. Or maybe this applied like back in the 80s, but for kids. So so I think there's I don't know if like people want to put in chat sort of like what their background is, how many people are like from the Tech Academy, and like how many are like went through the full stack, like learning Python, C#, like a bunch of languages versus learning a specific language versus learning a stack. I imagine that there's some distribution of y'all where some of you, like had dabbled in a bunch of languages, whereas some of you have focused specifically on one language and a particular modern framework or stack. I would say is pick a language or two and stick with it. For the purposes of interviews, have a language that you're comfortable with and you are able to build on top of. And I mean, not with just all the fancy frameworks and libraries that you might have, but like the vanilla version of those languages. So some companies will give you an option to work with a preferred language. A lot of companies will actually do that. But you shouldn't, on the flip side, be listening, this company has PHP, this company has Ruby, I need to learn this now in order to apply. Just apply and stick to your language. And if you have to learn it, if they explicitly tell you you have to learn it for the interview, then that's when you do it. But what I'm saying is that building a strong competency in one language of a particular type will spill over to similar languages. So I make this analogy all the time. So I learned at the Tech Academy a little bit of JavaScript, mostly Python, mostly C#. I would say that C# versus Python is completely different, but JavaScript versus Python are pretty similar. I think about the Romance languages. So, like Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish have similar roots and they share vocabulary and syntactic structure. That's the same thing with Python versus JavaScript versus Ruby, maybe even versus PHP. So you building a core competency in one language, the more you learn in depth in that language, just the nitty gritty of how you're manipulating data types and structures, that's going to carry over, even if you don't know the specific built-in method in JavaScript, but you'll know the approach to how you would code it. And that's what's really critical, is like building those relationships across different language types. So another exercise that I ask people to do is try to port the same code that you wrote in a project to another language and see what the differences are for yourself. As an exercise, this will make you build confidence because you'll know, oh yeah, like 80% of my code line by line is very similar, but maybe I took advantage of specific benefits of Python because Python is very focused on lists, which are in JavaScript, they'll call them arrays, but like creating lists and list comprehension. But like in JavaScript, maybe there's better built-in functions for other things with like maps and reduce or things like that. So just go through the exercise of writing code in one language and then translating that into another context. The second part, don't use code and computers as crutches. I want to see people in the chat tell me, like, admit how many people like have used console.log all the time, or something to like print statement all the time to debug your code, whether it's Python or JavaScript. I just want to see people just like chatting and just admit it. I do it all the time. That's a huge problem with the way that we try to approach tech interviews, is like, especially ones that are saying like write code that has to execute on some sort of a platform. Is like, we want to debug code all the time, but that's a crutch. You want to think about your code holistically. You want to be able to have a plan and a recipe before you execute. If you baked a cake, you wouldn't like stop baking a cake at every step to make sure you did it correctly at that point in time. You would have the recipe, you would read through kind of what the instructions were, and then you would try to execute it all at once. You wouldn't go line by line or like step by step in order to bake a cake. That's exhausting, and it'd probably be horrible for your taste buds. So what I did was, before I worked at Flux, I interviewed at a few big companies. I interviewed at Microsoft and I interviewed at Google. And so as part of that process, it was a lot to learn about not to use code and computers as crutches. What that meant was, instead of writing, I would go to a website like leetcode.com or codewars.com, and I would find a problem, and instead of solving it in their like terminal or their platform or their REPL or whatever, I would write on a notebook in pseudocode, conceptually, like, what are the major steps that I had to do. Then I would write in a little bit more detail, like, okay, like, I know that I have to do a loop here. I know that I might have to use recursion here. But like, you're still conceptualizing things. Don't commit right away. Like, if you don't want to write 20 lines of code because you know it'll cost 20 lines of code, like, hand wave it away with organic natural language, pseudocode, comments, whatever is important. Writing on a whiteboard in a notebook forces you not to line by line debug. And so like, that's the bad habit that we all developed as beginning engineers that we need to break. We need to be able to think holistically about what the problem is and solve it. Even if we don't have the language, if you don't know the specific lines of code we're going to write, hand wave it away. Just know that I have to do a loop here. That's perfectly fine as you're starting to develop your solution to a coding challenge. Hand in hand with this is the concept of effective time management and the big picture. So if we don't set good boundaries on time, we'll get distracted by shiny things. And I hate being distracted by shiny things. Here's an example of a way that I would break down a 50-minute problem. It's not everybody's breakdown might be like slightly different, or this might be completely resonant with somebody, but like, these are the general ways in which I try to break down a problem. I spent the first 5 minutes scoping the problem, writing important info, like in terms of like, what are the variables, what are the inputs and outputs, asking questions from the interviewer, because you should ask questions from your interviewer. 10 minutes. And then I spend the next 10 minutes creating a generalized roadmap for the solution. This is where I do a lot of hand waving, and I say, well, I think I would want to put a loop here, or I think I want to go and transform this array into like a dictionary by doing this thing, or like talking in more generalities so that I can access it more quickly. But then, you're not committing to writing the lines of code. You're not actually writing down like, this is what I would do. Like, this is, like variable is equal to, and then you have some list comprehension thing or something like that. Then you spend the bulk of your time, say it's 25 minutes, once you have the plan of action, to execute on that plan of action. Fill in the blanks, translate that pseudocode to actual code, and then then debug as you've encountered the roadblocks. But I promise you that the problems that you'll encounter once you've outlined the problem outline the problem out with pseudocode will seem much more contextual and much clearer for you to refactor, because you spent the time not committing to things until it's absolutely necessary. And then you want to reserve maybe the last 5 to 10 minutes to discuss, once you finish, to discuss the pros and cons, optimizations, etc. with your code. Like, what is the best approach? What would you have done differently? How would you have saved time? What are some edge cases, etc., etc., etc. So another part is, whether it's a coding algorithm problem or talking about a project, be visual and be vocal when you're talking about code or software. So if you describe the service or a software product that you worked on, draw the components of the relationship. I mentioned this in a slide earlier, because when you're working things out in your head, there's this silence, because like this interview you're sitting in, especially when you're in a remote setting now, that I have to watch your face ruminate and like percolate things to your brain before coming out of your mouth. Like, no, like you want to walk the interviewer through the process. They need to know what the journey is and how you think and approach a problem. Also, to the extent that you're stuck, the interviewer is a huge resource. They're told as part of their training that they should provide some guidance. If you're going too far astray, they'll try to redirect you. That's something that you need to take advantage of as a resource when you're there. So here's a simple example of an architecture that I have used at work. So we have a platform at my company that allows users to interact, to write information and search for jobs, and write more information about themselves, sort of a combination of like a LinkedIn, job posting, and a few other HR related components. So the users primarily interact with this front end, which we call the client. They are able to create new information about themselves, or apply to jobs, or modify information in their professional profile. And we don't just let them do it willy-nilly. It's limited by this API. Like, we built out this API to give very specific context by which a user can interact to update their information and to go and interact with the system. That API in turn connects to our main database, and our main database stores a bunch of HR related information about our clients, a bunch of information with respect to your professional history, and a bunch of information about just like platform specific engagement things. So those first 3 boxes on the top left represent, in a very broad sense, the service that we provide. And you can fill in the details just by talking about those things. But the part that I work on primarily is having to do with analytics and data science with regard to the data that has been put to the database. But because we try to get all the data at once, it doesn't make sense that we interact directly with the database. Because then if we're hammering the database with our access and trying to get all our information, we're going to prevent other people from adding new information to the database. We need a way to be able to get access to that data without interrupting service. So what we do is we set up a replication service that the database is pushed to, and so every hour we make a backup of what the current state of the database is, and we store it to a data warehouse. So this is something that that our clients don't have access to, that we have access to internally to perform data science, BI, analytics. And what we connect to that directly is a reporting dashboard. And I actually need to switch this arrow because the data is coming from the data warehouse, or maybe it's a bi-directional arrow. But so we use a separate off-the-shelf platform to design reports and to provide database queries that gets us user engagement metrics, or gets us demographic information about like what are the organizational role breakdown of customers in our company, without interfering with the main transactional part of the service. This is something that is live, that we are using, that we are servicing thousands of customers with today. And I can describe this very generally speaking with 6 boxes and a couple of arrows. That's as simple as how you can go and design your architecture and talk about your architecture. What this does is this contextualizes for a person who has never seen your product before, how the connections between the different types of software products, what are those connections? How do they take place? What are the interactions that a user has? And then you can fill in the details with, like say you want to really go into the front end side, you could draw more things on the client side. You could show the different views. Or say that there are a couple of key API endpoints that you want to focus on. You can break up that API box into several boxes to show what are the main connections to the database that are actually mostly used, when people interact with your platform. Just remember that you can use a tool like draw.io, Lucidchart, any kind of wireframing software to kind of draw these relationships. And a lot of these are free. And I would recommend that for people in preparation of interviews where they have to talk about their projects, maybe do this beforehand so that when people ask you about your code and ask you to walk through it, you can refer really quickly and share your screen and say, here's an illustration of how all these things connect together. And I want to use that as the basis by which I deep dive into particular components of our software. Okay, so another tip that I would have for people who have to build things for their interviews is have some libraries, frameworks, etc. in your back pocket for your use case. And what does that mean? Well, so maybe you're applying for a front end job and they say, they want you to build, I want you to build me, and this is something that we ask people in prior jobs, like I want you to go and access this API that we'll give you. And I want you to show me a graph that shows this time series information that this API provides. So what does that mean? Like, what does that mean in terms of how you would do it? Well, if you're working in a modern framework, say you're working in React, you need a way to spin up a hello world, like a quick component that allows you to display data. So I need to know that. So I need to know, so like I know that if I have React, I can type a command in the terminal and I'd spin up a component, like in a very basic skeleton in like 5 seconds or 10 seconds. What else do I need? Well, you asked for me to go and make a chart. So I need some sort of a charting library. So, like maybe that's a chart.js, maybe it's hopefully not D3 because D3 is very cumbersome. Maybe it's victory.js. Maybe it's some other library that you use that makes bar charts, line charts, that sort of thing. The key is that you want to think about problems and how you learn, how you put technologies in your back pocket from the perspective of what am I doing versus what am I using? Don't think about it in terms of I need to know React, I need to know Victory.js, I need to know Node, I need to know this. Think about what am I doing? What is the user story? What is the stakeholder problem? So I have like 3 examples. I want you to spin up a quick visualization to see time series data from an API. Or I want you to transform payroll data for a company-wide analysis. I had to do this for my interview for Flux. They said, look at the New York payroll data. It's publicly available. Explore it and just give me some insights. So what I ended up doing was I spun up a Jupyter notebook because I said, I need a thing that shows me visualizations really quick, and I need a way to crunch large amounts of data relatively fast. And I need to do it and I want to have Markdown because I want to be able to write my thoughts and my comments like in a presentation style format. So for me, the Jupyter notebook seemed like an appropriate way for me to get all of those things all in one place. The third example, I want you to build me an API service that sends me dog pictures based on location. So like you need to know, okay, like what you need to know that you have to have a thing that displays images. You need to know that you have to build something that connects to an API. So you as you start to think about what are these things, you can think like, what are the technologies that get me to that point? But always think about it in terms of what is the problem that you're trying to solve. And then once you figured out the general categories of libraries, you figured out what your visualization library is, you figured out what your API library is, ask yourself, are there a lot of dependencies? Like, do I need to go and install 8 other things in order to install this one thing? Do I have to spend a lot of time explaining what this technology is? Is it so esoteric that most people are not going to use it? And as a result, I have to talk about spend 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking about this particular technology. Is it a unitasker? Is it something that's so specific that it does one small thing? If so, think about, could you just hand roll it yourself? What is the utility of making sure you do this one thing right with this one library? And then finally, is it overkill for the task at hand? A lot of people, for example, like they know that D3 is like this holy grail of like visualization libraries because it's super powerful and very flexible. But do you need a rocket launcher, like like targeting an ant? Like you really want to be able to say like, what is the best fit for the needs of wanting to create a component in an hour versus 4 hours? What are the cost benefits of you learning this very complicated thing for the purposes of an interview? And I think we're getting towards the end of our slides, but another thing is collaborate with friends and colleagues because like you can only get experience from the number of interviews that you're in. But if you're working with friends and colleagues, you can develop techniques with each other that you can understand in a very frank way what sort of your idiosyncrasies are, where your strengths and weaknesses, because you have friends who you can trust to give you honest and critical feedback with respect to how you are interviewing. So some suggestions that I would say is agree on some common problems that everybody can work on together. Use a whiteboard, take turns role playing. So some of you might be the interviewer, some of you might be interviewees. If you can't meet in person, swap your code online using a service like REPL.it. Make sure that remember that you're here to make yourselves better, and you're here in a safe environment. So ask and be asked tough questions and give specific, objective, constructive feedback. It is good to be able to support each other, and you should also support each other through this process, but we can't improve if we're also not being honest about things that we want to build and improve on. So make sure that you're trusting your colleagues to do the same for you as you will do for them. And then encourage and support each other as you struggle through this process, because it's a process. Like I applied for jobs for months after I graduated from Tech Academy. I didn't get a job right away. I applied to probably about 30 plus jobs at the time. And, we're in much more difficult economic times, but even when the economy was more healthy, relatively speaking, it still took time for me to go through this process. And finally, in addition to having friends working with you, like arrange mock interviews with a mentor in the industry, somebody like me. But I mean, like find more than just somebody like me, because I'm only one data point. So this again works and leverages that general tips about building relationships. Like say, I don't have any jobs right now. We're kind of in a freeze right now at my company. I would love to hire junior engineers and mentor them, but I'll spend my time volunteering and helping people out if they want to work through a problem. If they sent me a LinkedIn message and they say, "Hey, Chris, I was working on this problem and I just need to figure out some best steps on how to visualize something. Can you spend an hour with me?" Happy to do it. Follow a lot of the structure above with respect to this whiteboarding a problem with the collaborating with friends. Like make sure that you're simulating that experience as much as possible. Like really take advantage of the fact that this mentor is here to kind of put you in a simulated environment and give you honest feedback. Now in terms of resources and materials. So for those of you who are worried when they hear about oh, I've got to study data structures and I've got to study algorithms and this computer science stuff, here's a few resources that I think are amazing for you to get started. And then you can sort of develop your way afterwards in terms of what you gravitate towards. So these were resources that I found helpful when I last interviewed for jobs. If you're a JavaScript person and you've kind of plunked around with JavaScript, but don't feel like you have a really solid grasp of the core reasons behind vanilla JavaScript, why we use certain data types, why things perform a certain way. Eloquent JavaScript is an amazing resource, and it's interactive. It's an interactive website, a PDF, an ebook, but it's free if you interact with the website. There's consoles in there that you can go and type in and sandbox code. If you just want to understand the essentials behind a coding language taught in a narrative format, this is a great resource. For those wanting to know about data structures and algorithms, I recommend to everybody grokking algorithms. It is specifically written in Python, so for those who don't have a Python experience, you might have to readjust your brain with regard to the specific lingo that they use. But this is a beautiful, hand illustrated book that kind of goes in a little tongue in cheek and a very dip your toes into understanding algorithms. It meant to be not intimidating at all. And after I finished that book, I read through that. I went through a specific elements of programming interviews, which is in multiple languages. This will give a chapter by chapter breakdown of different types of data structures, different types of coding smells and coding tells, and we'll go into a deep dive with questions for you to work on. And then, of course, there are the online websites, leetcode.com, codewars.com. I did primarily a lot of my studying on leetcode.com because I can sort by the type of data structure that's involved in a problem, the company, the difficulty, many different types of dimensions. So it was a great resource for that. And it's a basis by which, I start formulating questions for myself to give to others. Okay, so that's the end of all of my advice. It looks like we're at 2:14. I think we're a little over time right now, but if If people are willing to stick around for another 15 minutes or so, I can introduce this take-home coding challenge, as well as put another challenge in chat. And if people have any questions, I'm happy to go on. So it really is kind of up to whatever the timing. Rick, where do we have capacity to spend a little bit more time? Or like Tony?
Yeah, we definitely can. And anyone is welcome to ask questions. They can unmute their mic and ask questions, or they can ask questions in the chat. And yeah, so we can spend a little more time here, definitely.
Yep. Cool. All right. So I'm going to go and walk through this take-home coding challenge. People are more than welcome to work on it or not. It doesn't hurt my feelings. And then I'll give a much quicker one in the chat that I recently devised if I can find where it is. But this is something that I usually give one-on-one to my ad hoc mentorships and other coding bootcamp grads. It's a little bit of an everything problem. So it's an algorithms problem, but we try to talk about it in a designy sort of way. So I'm here to kind of make things vague in some sense, so that you can work through the problem and ask me follow-up questions. So for people who are comfortable with algorithms and data structures, this is maybe a 30 to 45-minute problem, but I typically give 2 weeks for people who are like, to work at their pace, for those who are just getting their feet wet and trying to learn about how to approach these problems in general, trying to develop those skills. All right, so here's the challenge. So you're going to be given a task by a senior engineer who's transitioning to product manager. Their instructions may therefore be vague or subject to interpretation, so it's up to you to ask follow-up questions. Assume nothing and plan out accordingly. Good luck. All right, so I'm going to role play the role of a senior engineer. So as you know, our product is an image processor that can read the suits and values off a deck of playing cards. Unfortunately, the output of the processor are two arrays. An array of suits and an array of values in the order that they were processed. So if you had two cards that was the ace of hearts and the queen of spades, you would have one array that was ace, queen, and the second array that was hearts, spades. Let's see if I can remember two cards in a row. So we want you to make a function that will merge these arrays into a single data structure. So one variable or whatever, one output that I can access that should be able to access a specific card. So I should be able to, from an engineering perspective, say, I want to know what the third card is. And then I want to be able to access that specific card's properties, i.e., I want to be able to know like if the third card's suit in what I call an engineering friendly way. And so that's open to interpretation. Oh, we also want to have the option of sorting the cards in one of four ways. By value. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, 10, or whatever the cards are. By suit. So like, hearts, spades, diamonds, whatever that order is. And then the combination of suit value, then suit, and by suit, then value. And of course, I want an option to also just keep it unsorted. Another thing, I want you to present me two versions in two different languages. You can choose the two languages, but they have to be generally similar. So like if you pick Java for one, you can't pick Ruby for the other. It's so that we can have an easy time understanding the pros and cons of two similarly situated languages. Oh, and you can't use any built-in sorting functions for the languages you chose. So you can't use array dot sort or whatever. You can't use sorting algorithms. You can't use built-ins for this because we want to be able to hand roll our own functions for sorting. I don't need the fastest option, but if you want to discuss with me, I want you to be able to talk to me about what are the pros and cons of the option you chose versus the options that you could have chosen specific to this ticket. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I respond once a day, so think about what you want to ask. When you have a solution, you can send me a link on repl.it to stage your code. And that's it. That's the problem. And again, I think Rick will provide these slides so that if people want to refer back to this information, they get access to that.
Yeah, we will post the talk on our YouTube channel as well.
Right.
So anyone that wants to go back and rewatch parts of it can definitely do that. And we'll get the slides posted as well. And really good talk, Chris. That was really good information how it really works when you're going to find your first job, and kind of the things you need to know.
Yep. And one other thing is that if people want to see, I wrote this code for a ticket at work that actually did involve an algorithm and data structure. I scrubbed sort of any sort of data that would be related to the actual context of the code. But if people want to see something quicker on REPL.it, for those who haven't seen it, here is an additional problem in this link right here. And it's in JavaScript. This is a JavaScript problem for those of you who are more JavaScript friendly.
Cool. Yeah. Now, do you, Chris, do you find that with things going to a lot of remote work, do you find that it's going to open up a lot of jobs like countrywide?
Yeah, I would highly recommend that for those of you who are in a specific market to open up your reach to remote positions. A lot of companies now, I've seen just in the last month or so, a lot of companies are now like that were only location specific are now opening up remote positions. I think that even to the extent that, you know, like that they aren't explicitly putting in, like maybe throw your name in the hat for a really large company because they probably have some work from home policies in place. And you might start out initially remote, and if you get the offer and you have managed to do a great job, like let that decision point happen then when people are starting to move back in. Like take advantage of the fact that we are remote.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of jobs will be opening up as things get better, just for that, with a lot more opportunities. So. Cool stuff. Oh, and if anyone can solve the coding challenge in the next 10 minutes, we do have a job for you.
Nice plug. Yeah, and so like yeah, if you want to get connected with me, I'm on LinkedIn. Happy to meet one-on-one with people, time permitting, of course. But like I said, like it's better to ask and to kind of figure that out. And yeah, thank you again to Rick and Tony and the Tech Academy for giving me the chance to bloviate for an hour and a half on tech interviews. It's a passion of mine to make sure people get jobs. I know it's a huge investment for people when they're making a career shift. So I'm here to support you in your endeavors.
Thank you so much, Chris. I've personally been able to learn a lot. I think I've about 8 pages of notes here, and I'll be definitely going back to rewatch some of the parts of the video. Does anyone else have any questions for Chris right now? No? Okay.
Yeah, and the Tech Talk, like I said, will be posted on YouTube. That was a great presentation, Chris. Really well articulated, and we really appreciate you coming out today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and yeah, let me know if there's any other way that I can help out in the future. Happy to continue making the connections.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
No, sounds good. Want to thank everyone for coming out today, and we will see you for the next Tech Talk.
All right, everyone.
All right. Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Take care.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.